Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel, Natty the Coder. In today's video, we're going to be talking about web development roadmap in 2022. So a lot of people are pretty confused about the web development roadmap and they don't know where to get started and what to learn first. And then, for example, if I learn one thing, then what should be the next step? And they see they don't know about the career paths, like what are the technologies, the specific technologies or the state of the art technologies that I need to learn, and I can get a job quickly, or I could be a professional. So in this video I brought and gathered a lot of the technologies that we can use nowadays and people are using nowadays. I'll show you guys how you can just go through them and what step after another you can take and what technologies you can use one by one, and just go through different job descriptions, and I'll show you what companies are expecting from you, what skills are required, and I'll show you how you guys get your CV up to a level and how you can mention your skills and all that. So just make sure that you stick to this. Let's just get started. So first thing first, you can see this hell of a diagram. This is quite small in here, but yeah, I'll zoom in a while and you would see what are the things in here. At first glance you would see that it's quite hard, or how to achieve that, but I think the key thing is to be consistent in your learning, and you should be picky and what you want to learn. Actually, you don't have to learn all of these things, and I'll show you what you can actually learn and what you can skip in the video. So yeah, so the first thing that we're going to be talking about is basically the web development. So we'll see what is web development actually. So web development is basically building and maintaining websites. It is the work that happens behind the scenes to make a website look great, work fast, and perform well with a seamless user experience. And nowadays you can see a lot of websites like or web applications like Facebook, and you can see the Google search engine and a lot of different cool websites like YouTube and all that. So web developers or devs who do this by using a variety of coding languages, and the languages that they use depends on the types of tasks they are performing and the platforms on which they are working actually. So web development skills are in highly demand worldwide and well paid too, but making development a great career option, it's sometimes a bit harder for someone and they don't know where to go. So it is one of the easiest accessible higher paid fields, as you do not need a traditional university degree to become qualified for this. The field of web development is basically or generally broken down into two main pieces. Basically, one is the front end and the second one is the backend. So front end is basically the user facing side that you see the cool things, on the, for example, on the Facebook, you can see all of your profile and your friend list and all the cool UI that you can interact with. And basically there is the backend thing, like the database and where your business logic actually resides. So in this diagram you can see I have the web development over here, and then I have the front end over here on the left side, and then I have backend on the right side. So these are the two core things, and we'll talk about both of them one by one. So coming to the front end side, you can see that we have three things over here actually. So on the front end side we have HTML, then CSS on the same line, and then we have JavaScript. So these are the three things that you need to learn actually, and these are the core things on the front end side if you want to be a front end engineer. So basically, like most of the companies hire front end engineers, back end engineers, DevOps engineers, and mostly cloud engineers. So all of them have like their own responsibilities. So we will talk about it. Like, what is a front end engineer? So a front end developer or engineer takes care of the layout, basically the design and interactivity using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. What you see and what you use, such as the visual aspects of the website, for example, the drop-down menus, the text boxes, the buttons, and everything that are all brought together by the front-end developers who writes a series of programs to bind and structure the elements, makes them look good and add interactivity. These programs are run through the browser. So basically you have to learn actually the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Those are the core things that you need to learn first. and then you can dig into more. So basically on the HTML side, we don't have much things. You just have to learn, basic HTML and HTML5, and then you can just move along to CSS. But in the HTML, you must have to know the basic tags, or at least you should have a good command on the tags, like section HTML5 tags at least that are introduced recently. So you should have a command on that. So basically, that's a part on HTML. On the CSS side, basically 3 sections over here. Basically the architecture, the preprocessors, and the frameworks. So what is basically CSS BEM? It's basically called a block, element, and modifier methodology. So it's basically a front-end naming method for organizing and naming the CSS classes actually. So it's nothing more than that. Let's say we have a card component that you build with HTML and CSS. So it's basically with BEM, it's a methodology to organize and name your CSS classes in a more descriptive way. So for example, you can see that is basically the card, and within the card you have a card image, and then the card title, and then a card description, and then a card button that can take you anywhere. So that is basically BEM. We call it normally BEM. Then we have preprocessors and CSS. So there are 3 kinds of preprocessors, and we will talk about this as well. So a CSS preprocessor is basically a program that lets you generate CSS from the preprocessor's own syntax. There are many CSS preprocessors to choose from basically, but I've chosen the top one that I personally like. And however, most of the CSS preprocessors will add some features that don't exist in pure CSS, such as make sense, and those are basically functions, and nesting selector, inheritance selector, and so on. So you turn to be working like a programming language and CSS. So basically they're pretty useful to be learned, and you'll get a lot of hands on this. So it's really good to learn these preprocessors. And then we have actually a lot of frameworks on CSS that are built on top of CSS. One is Tailwind CSS. This is my top pick, and also the Bootstrap. So Tailwind CSS is basically a CSS first framework that is built on top of CSS. It actually gives you the classes and actual CSS classes, a lot of CSS classes that you don't have to write CSS in your HTML explicitly, but you can just use the classes and just use like that. On top, Bootstrap it's really useful as well. It's basically built on top of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's not just pure CSS. You get some access to components like drop-down menus and navigation bars and all that. So you have some interactivity in Bootstrap as well. And both of them gives you, responsive design, and you can quickly, put your hands on this, and you don't have to worry about using media queries and CSS and, design your website responsively. So what is basically responsive design? Is basically to make your website accessible on all of the different devices, for example, on desktop or your laptop or your tablet or your mobile smartphone or mobile. So basically that's it about the CSS part. Now let's just move to the JavaScript part. So in JavaScript, we have a lot of things to cover basically. So we'll talk about first the frameworks, and we also have some type checkers and testing. So if you already know if you already have some knowledge about type JavaScript, and you want to learn JavaScript, then these are the good things that you need to learn basically. So let's talk about JavaScript frameworks. So just like the CSS, like we have Tailwind and Bootstrap on top of CSS, something like that, we have other frameworks that are built on top of JavaScript. So I'll talk about the top frameworks that I picked over here. The first one that I'll talk about is basically the Angularjs. That's also called Angular now. So basically, you can learn the Angular framework, and it's basically totally based on TypeScript. So in Angular, you have to learn first of all the state management, how you can manage the state of the application, and how you can render some components dynamically or based on your state in the application. and then you have to learn this tool or library that is built in Angular that's called Ngrx. So it's basically a store that provides reactive state management for Angular applications, and it's basically inspired by Redux. Also, for async code in Angularjs, you can use RxJS library that is called a reactive library or reactive programming. It's basically RxJS is basically a library for reactive programming using observables to make it easier to compose asynchronous or callback based code. If you're learning JavaScript and you come down to AngularJS, so basically you would come across a concept that's called single page applications. So single page applications is basically all of two types. So basically either they will render on the client side, or basically if you want to render them on the backend side. Client side rendering an application is rendered basically on the browser, and then if you want to fetch some data, then you have to make an AJAX call to the server and get the data back, and you can just update a portion of your website through that AJAX call, or through that requested data. But if you want to render your application, your single page application, now on the backend side, or basically on the server, then you have to use another library or framework that is called Universal and AngularJS, and that is good for that. So basically the Universal framework or any server-side rendering, we mostly use it for search engine optimization, because if you want your website to be optimized by the search engine and you want it to be shown on in the search list by Google, then you must have to do you must have to render your application on the server side. So that's basically what it's useful for, and it's good to learn actually. And for the mobile applications, if you want to build mobile applications nowadays, so you can either use native script or Ionic, that is basically based on Angular. So it's basically the same framework, but but through these frameworks, the native scripts and Ionic, you can have access to the native mobile APIs, and you can build your mobile applications with that. And if you want to test your Angular application, the components or the logic and everything, you can use Karma for that. So it's basically a good tool to test your Angular application. So basically what is testing? So basically software testing is the act of examining the artifacts and behavior of the software under test by validation and verification. Software testing can also provide an objective or independent view of the software to allow the business to appear and understand the risk of software implementation. If you implement, for example, a new feature, then you want to write, some test cases for that. So when another developer or another engineer works on adding some more features and modifying the feature, so those tests will make sure or verify that it doesn't break the functionality or the expected behavior of the feature. So that's what we want to make the test or write the tests for. Now moving forward to the second framework in JavaScript, that is basically React.js, and it's a very, very popular framework nowadays, and it's been developed by Facebook. So in here, if you want to have the client side React.js application, if you want to run the class, it's only on the client side. So you can probably use the boilerplate that's created by Facebook themselves, that's called React CRA, Create React Application. So that's basically a command line interface or tool that you can use to create your React application. So in here, you have to learn state management basically. For state management, we have a lot of tools and libraries in React. So the top ones are basically Redux, Stat Machine, and MobX. I personally prefer Stat Machine, then Redux, and then MobX. But they're basically the top picks that I would prefer anyone that can learn. So basically, if you tend to work with the front-end applications or the front-end frameworks, then you would come across the stat management concept more often, and you would know what is stat management. But that is required to So basically, your whole application is based on this state. That's why you have to learn these tools actually. And now there are some other tools or useful things that you need to learn basically. So first thing that I prefer, that I personally used a lot, basically is React Query. It's a very good tool and package that you can work on, and some key concepts like hooks and React.js, they're pretty powerful and useful, and also the component architecture. So it's basically normal if you're working with any of the front-end frameworks nowadays, either it is Angular or React or Swell or Vue Js. you'll be using the components architecture. So it's pretty normal. So if you want to have a React.js rendered basically on the server side, so in that case, you can use Next.js or Remix nowadays as well. Remix is basically something similar to Next.js, but yeah, probably both have their pros and cons, and you can choose one of them. So yeah, it's better to learn either of them. And then for the UI, basically for the user interface, we have a lot of components libraries in React. So the topics that I came across are basically Material UI that I personally use a lot in a lot of places, and most of the companies that I work with, they are using Material UI. So people just go ahead and reskin or retheme it, and you have a lot of components built in, and you don't have to write everything from scratch. You just take the design and reskin it, or customize it based on your needs. And similar thing is basically Chakra UI and then Radix UI. So my first pick would be Material UI and then Chakra and then Radix. And also, if you want to build some mobile applications using React.js, then you can learn this framework that's called React Native. That is basically useful for building the mobile applications, and it's really powerful. So people are making mobile applications based on React Native nowadays. And then also for testing, of course, you can use Jest and the React testing library, either of them or both of them together. That's up to you guys. And there is also one other concept that is called static site generation. So basically, a static site generator is a tool that generates a full static HTML website based on the raw data and a set of templates. So essentially, a static site generator automates the task of coding individual HTML pages and gets those pages ready to serve to users ahead of time. So basically, that's how you can do it with React. So for that, you have to learn Gatsby. Now moving forward to the third front-end framework that is basically called Swell Js. So basically, Swell Js is a free and open source front-end compiler, and it's basically really powerful framework nowadays, and it's coming up with a lot of developers, and many companies are tending towards Svelte now. It's really easy. If you work with React.js for some time, then you'll realize that it's a bit messy, and the state management and hooks and all that's a bit harder to manage then. But Svelte gives you a lot of hands in that, and you don't have to worry about the performance issues and all that. So it's really good to learn Svelte JS as well. And the fourth framework is basically Vue Js. So Vue Js is basically also a very good framework. It has its own state management library called Vuex. And if you want to, learn the server side of the Vue Js or render your Vue Js application on the server side, then you would have to learn Nuxt.js. That's basically built on top of Vue Js. So yeah, these are basically the four top frameworks of my choice, basically. So first of all, if you're new to these frameworks, then I would suggest to go for React first, because it has a lot that you can learn, and you'll have a good idea of how the components architecture work and how you can use different tools and text to work with React. And also you'll have some idea of the static side generation, also the server side rendering of applications. And the second choice, or my second pick, would be Svelte JS, because it's pretty powerful and easy to use. So I prefer that. And then you can go for Angular either or Vue JS. But these two would be my top picks for any person that is getting started with the JavaScript frameworks. Now let's just talk about type checkers. So in JavaScript, we don't have any type checking or any static type checking. But with TypeScript, you explicitly have to define during the declaration of, for example, a function or variable, what type of data I'd expect and what type of data it returns and all that. So basically, for that reason, we use TypeScript, and it's really useful. And a lot of companies are demanding TypeScript nowadays. So it's a must-have skill nowadays, and it's really good to know. And it's basically, TypeScript is also basically called superset of JavaScript. So it's basically JavaScript with types. So yeah, that's what it is. And then we have Flow in place. So Flow is basically built by Facebook. My top pick would be to get started with TypeScript first and then go to Flow if you want to learn, but it's not important because I've never seen like any company asking for Flow, but it's very rare. But yeah, TypeScript is very good to learn. And also, if you want to test your JavaScript code, and I'm not talking about the framework, but JavaScript itself. So for testing, you can use either Mocha or Chai. You can use either of these libraries to test your JavaScript code. So yeah, that was basically it about JavaScript. So you can see it's a pretty huge, messy graph. And I'll also share this graph with you guys so then you can just go through each of them one by one and see how it really looks. And I can also point you to some resources. So you can see that we have in the web development side, we have the front end, and on the front end we have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then we have in the CSS we have the architecture, and then the preprocessor, and then frameworks of CSS. And then we have in JavaScript we have the frameworks of JavaScript, and then we have type checkers, and then we have testing. Okay, so these are the main three concepts that you must need to learn. And in the frameworks you can learn at least two of them would be efficient, to get a job. And basically in any job you can basically working at a company, or for getting a job, I think React.js would be more than enough. But for learning purposes, I would definitely propose or suggest to learn Swell Js or either of and the framework that you like to learn. So at least two of the frameworks I would like you guys to learn. And then for type checkers, I would suggest you guys to learn first TypeScript, and if you're good then you can also go for Flow, but that's not required totally. And then for testing, it's basically totally makes sense to learn testing and how you can test your code. And there are different approaches of testing your code and writing test cases and how they are basically meant to be. So yeah, I'll show that in a minute. So now the second part of the web development is basically the backend. And you can see we have a lot of things on the backend as well. So basically you have on the very first branches, you have databases and languages. So what languages you can use on the backend actually, and what are the databases that you can learn on the backend. So basically let's just talk about the languages. So first of all, you can see that you have PHP in place, you have JavaScript, you have Python, Ruby, Rust, Go, C#, and you have C++ and all that. But these are my top picks that you can learn, and people are using them in the real world applications, and there's a lot of demand for that. And the first thing that I would vote for is basically JavaScript, and basically not JavaScript but Node.js. That is basically the runtime environment for JavaScript. So basically how JavaScript works as basically it is compiled through the V8 engine and Chrome, and there are different names for each engine and different browsers. So you would come across that when you're learning. So basically that environment is taken out and you can install it on your machine basically, and you can run JavaScript within the Node.js environment. So it's basically a runtime environment for JavaScript. So you have to learn this, and with that you have to learn Express.js. That's basically a very, very popular framework that's built on top of Node.js. So basically most of the time when you install Node.js, so you see a lot of people are working with Express. So Express.js is a must to learn thing nowadays. And also there is another framework that is basically called Dino, that is basically built by the same person who developed or created Node.js. But yeah, it would be the second choice, but it's not required. I've never seen until now like any job requirement that would ask for Dino skills. But yeah, that's a good to have. But yeah, probably you should go with the Node.js first. So with PHP, you have a lot of frameworks that you can learn. So you can go for Laravel, you can go for Zend, Yi, CodeIgniter, or Symfony. But the top pick is basically Laravel, that if you want to learn PHP, then it's must to have, and you must learn Laravel. You can also use Laravel with either of the front-end frameworks like React and Angular, or any frameworks that you like. It has its own configuration, but you can also use PHP Laravel as it is and build your whole application with PHP only, and you would not require any front-end framework. And also Zend, Yi, CodeIgniter, and Symfony. I would personally prefer to learn Symfony as well. But if you're learning PHP, then I would like you guys to learn Laravel first, because it's pretty powerful and big and scalable. You can learn that first. And for the rest of 4, it's up to you guys if you want to learn, then it's good to have. But they're not that different from each other. And then on the Python, you can see that we have Django framework and Flask framework that you can write your backend application in with Django framework or either Flask. And between these two, I would go for Django first. I will learn this because it's pretty good and easy to learn as well. If you don't have prior knowledge to Python, then you can go ahead first learn Python. It's a really good programming language that you can learn. It's easy to learn. It's object oriented and it's really, really powerful. And it's been used in a lot of places, not just web development or on the back end. It's also used in data science and machine learning and all that. So it's probably a good choice to learn Python, and then you can just use either of these frameworks to build your APIs or write your backend and for the web application. And then you can also use Ruby on Rails is basically the framework that you can use on the backend. You can go for Rust, you can go for Golang actually, and then C# ASP.NET. So a lot of people are working on ASP.NET as well. It's a pretty powerful programming language, and this framework is really, really used. A lot of companies have the demand for ASP.NET as well. So for me, my top picks would be to go for Node.js first because it's being used a lot, and then either you can go for PHP or C# and also Python. So those would be my top pick. Ruby, Rust, and Go, they're used by companies who have their specific requirements. For example, each of these languages have their own pros and cons, like scalability and the processing power and all that. So if you're going into those details, then you can pick from either of these languages. Otherwise, you can go ahead with Node.js, PHP, and C#. Those would be the top ones. And you can also go for Ruby, Rust, and Go. Those are also really, really powerful languages. So that is it about the programming languages on the backend that you can learn, and the frameworks as well. They're there. Now let's talk about databases and on the backend side. So we have 3 things in databases actually: the databases itself, the ORMs, and then the concepts. Basically, what concepts you need to clarify in order to work with databases. So first of all, let's just talk about databases first, and then we'll talk about the rest of the 2. So in databases, we have 2 types of databases. We have SQL and NoSQL databases. We can call them SQL or NoSQL, or if you want to pronounce it just like SQL or NoSQL, you can do that as well, but it's up to you guys. SQL is basically a very, very famous, popular, and powerful database that's being used by a lot of tech giants and a lot of companies. First thing first, you have to learn MySQL. That's a must to have. You must learn MySQL. If you want to learn with SQL databases, or we also call them RDBMS or Relational Database Management Systems. And then we have MariaDB, MSSQL. So these are basically the same but a little bit different. There's basically Microsoft SQL. Then we have Postgres SQL, and then we have Oracle. So my personal choices are basically MySQL and PostgreSQL. And also you can go for MariaDB and Oracle or MSSQL. That's up to you guys, but MySQL would be my topic and learn first thing, and then I would go for PostgreSQL. And the NoSQL databases, we have MongoDB, CouchDB, DynamoDB, Cassandra, and Firebase. So in here, a lot of people are using, and a lot of companies are using MongoDB, and also DynamoDB. That's basically provided by AWS, Amazon Web Services. And also Firebase has been provided by Google Cloud. So my topic over here is basically Firebase. I can go for Firebase if I want to use NoSQL, or DynamoDB. So I've worked with AWS a lot. I like DynamoDB personally as well, and then MongoDB. And then you can go for either of them. So basically Firebase, it also gives you the NoSQL database. You can create and write your documents in there. But on other hand, it also has this a cool feature of real-time database. So you can, if you want to build some real-time applications, just like Uber, or just an example, just like Uber, where you can see live updates for your data streams, then you can go for Firebase. Yeah, these are basically the database that I would want you guys to learn. But yeah, Firebase would be my topic on the NoSQL, and then DynamoDB, and then you can go for MongoDB. But it's not required that you have to learn all of them, because NoSQL databases are not often used by the companies, but they often tend to, use the relational database management system like MySQL and PostgreSQL. And in some companies, I've seen that they use Firebase and DynamoDB or MongoDB for their databases. But I think if you learn one of them, then you will have an idea already. You would already have an idea of how the NoSQL databases actually work. While you learn the databases, then you have some concepts to clarify basically. So the first one is basically ACID, and ACID is basically an acronym that refers to the set of 4 key properties that define transaction. But that's basically atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability of database. If a database has these ACID properties, it can be called an ACID transaction. You would have to learn about transactions, and there is this N+1 problem that is called, it's basically a performance issue in object relational mapping. I won't go to the details, but yeah, you should clarify these kind of concepts while learning the databases. Normalization of the table, so how you can efficiently store data and how you can create different relations to different tables, so based on the normalizations and all that. And then you have to learn about indexes. So it's good to know what are indexes and how we can use them actually. So those are the concepts you must clarify while learning about databases. Now we have a term that is called ORM, that is called Object Relational Mapping. So it's basically, in computer science, it's basically a programming technique for converting data between type systems using object-oriented programming languages. It creates basically, in effect, a virtual object database that can be used from within the programming language. So it is really useful tools. And we have a lot of different ORMs that you can use, but for MySQL databases, I would go for SQLite or Prisma. Prisma, I've recently used it and it's really, really powerful and it's really useful. So my first pick would be to learn Prisma first, and you would know how to create relations between tables and how to create different models for your data tables and all that, and how to create migrations and all that. That's basically the core concepts for any database. And then for the NoSQL, for the MongoDB, I would go for Mongoose to learn. So basically these are the ORMs tool that you can learn. So yeah, that is basically it on the backend side of the web application. So you can see that we have databases and languages, and then we have different languages that we can go for, and we have different frameworks, and also what concept that I need to clarify on the databases, and then we have what type of databases do we have, and which you can learn from, and also the ORM systems that you have to learn. So this is what builds your application, the backend and frontend, and when you combine them, then it builds your whole application. So there is basically the interactivity on the UI, and there is this backend stuff that holds your business logic, and you deal with the database and all that.